policy here at the coordinating board when the temperature gets over 90 degrees that casual shirts are appropriate business wear. Thank you all for coming. We have an important issue to talk about today, of course, and that's the recommendations that will be made to me and in turn to the coordinating board regarding formula funding. I'd like to talk a little bit about the context in which we are doing our work this time around. I've been around for quite a while, and I think that what's shaping up in terms of the 2016 national elections will see that higher education will play a more significant role on the agendas of presidential candidates and has been the case in my lifetime. As all of you know, Hillary Clinton came out with some rather dramatic recommendations, a program that will cost $350 billion over the next 10 years, representing some rather dramatic changes in the way higher education conducts its affairs. Marco Rubio has come out very aggressively against some common practices in higher education. I saw a quote where he talks about blowing up the higher education cartel, which of course seems to suggest that higher education institutions are working in collusion to maintain or to raise the cost of tuition and fees and are working in a way that doesn't represent the best interests of students, but rather represents the particular interests of institutions. I have here you can't see it from where you are, but this is a current issue of Change magazine. And the lead story, the cover story in the magazine is Moving the Attainment Agenda from Policy to Action. And in the very first paragraph of this article, it essentially says that this is only that universities and colleges are calling for dramatic change. And the article reads, this is only the first stage of reform. For states to reach these goals of much higher attainment rates will require different policy and institutional change never seen before in higher education. That's a context in which we have convened this meeting to talk about formula funding. Let me just make a few points about some of the more salient charges that you have. Number one, to recommend appropriate levels of funding. Last time, it was the recommendations essentially were try to restore funding to levels that were in place before the 2011 budget cuts, dramatic, draconian budget cuts. And I had commented to staff and to members of the committees that seemed to me to be overly optimistic. If you look at the pattern of state funding in Texas as well as other states around the country, you never get back up to those ideal levels of funding or levels of funding that you thought were adequate. I knew that, as most others did, that it was highly unlikely that Governor Abbott would come into office and raise the size of the budget dramatically, particularly in relation to higher education. The last thing I can imagine the Republican governor would do would come into office and get a reputation as a free spending, as a free spender. And so I was not surprised that we got the level of increases that we did. And as we move farther and farther away from the 2009 levels of funding or 2007 levels of funding, I think it's less and less likely that we can expect will come anywhere near to those levels of funding on a student FTE basis. So please keep that in mind. Obviously, we want to to underscore the importance of undergraduate success for the Formula Funding Advisory Committees. Obviously, those of you from universities and health-related institutions have other priorities as well, but I remind you, as my colleague David Gardner frequently points out, that almost 90% of college students in Texas are undergraduates. Our first priority has to be getting undergraduates through the pipeline, whether it's through a technical college, whether it's through a community college to an associate's degree, whether it's from a community college to transfer to a university. Undergraduate education has to be our primary emphasis. I want to emphasize the point in this article that I just cited. Everything we know about higher education suggests that we've got as much out of the current system as we're likely to get. It is not. To me, it's not coincidental that if you take a look at the equity agenda, which is clearly a major concern for virtually everybody, the concern that higher education is no longer the engine of social and economic mobility that it was as recently as right after World War II and through the Great Society and into the 1970s. That for almost 40 years, what higher education has done, unfortunately, particularly if you look at the work of James Heckman, who's a Nobel Prize-winning economist at the University of Chicago, he would argue that what higher education has done is to entrench inequities and differential outcomes over the past 40 years. And I think all of us believe that we need to restore that role of higher education as being, once again, an engine of economic and social mobility. But my point was, if you look at the fact that higher education is stagnated in terms of providing opportunities for poor young people, I think it's fairly safe to conclude that we have a system that doesn't lend itself to those kinds of achievements. For example, the pursuit of prestige in U.S. News and World Report rankings, although everybody who knows anything about higher education knows that those rankings are virtually worthless. I know that they're significant, and I know that people pay attention to them, but I don't think anybody that knows anything about higher education believes they're remotely accurate. But if you look at what we do in higher education, for example, there's been a movement away from need-based merit in this country, not in Texas, thank God, but around the country. There's been a movement to merit-based financial aid. Why? In order to attract students who've achieved higher at higher levels, who have higher SAT and ACT scores, because those are two of the primary criteria for ranking in the U.S. News and World Report system. We do other things that simply do not help poor students succeed. I hope that as you take a look at recommendations for formula funding, that you will take into account at a very fundamental level the need to improve undergraduate student success. According to one study that I read recently and cited in some remarks I made a few months ago, Texas is 42nd among the states in the success of poor kids at the higher education level. 42nd. And that's particularly troubling when we see that over 60% of students in the public K through 12 system in Texas are poor, are deemed poor by their qualification for free or reduced lunches. We have to change that reality of higher education. I hope you will think about ideas that will help us make some progress in this regard. We have, all of you know, I think that we've been here at the coordinating board. We have been aggressively promoting the concept of competency-based education. My own particular emphasis has been to do it first in graduate education, because it seems to me it lends itself so well there, and then let's get it right in graduate education, and then let's move down and do it more in undergraduate education. But I think it's something that we need to take a look at across the board. We now have 2 institutions in Texas that have degree programs, and you know who they are, that are based to a large extent on competency-based advancement. We have Texas A&M Commerce, and we have South Texas College that have these affordable baccalaureates, which so far look like they're working well. They're not perfect. They still need tweaking as we try to expand the model. We're going to do things somewhat differently, but this is a model that can work and help students achieve credentials at much lower cost than is normally the case. And we have to find a way to proliferate those programs around the state. I'm not talking about every institution. I'm not talking about every program. I'm not talking about every student. But we need to have that pathway available in every region of the state. And to the extent that you can recommend ways to do competency-based education, we would appreciate it. The complaint that we hear most frequently when we talk about expanding competency-based education is, how does it cohere? How does competency-based education fit with the way we allocate formula funding? Well, let's figure out a way to do it that makes that approach more attractive to institutions. As I said, it's relatively simple to do at the graduate level, because at the graduate level, typically we have qualifying exams, particularly at the doctoral level. It would be easy, for example, instead of saying that you have to take 60 hours or 90 hours of coursework beyond the baccalaureate or beyond the master's degree in order to take qualifying exams, why not just give the students a body of material that they have to master, and whenever they master it, advance them to candidacy? You can demonstrate that they know what they're supposed to know. That's something that we need to take a look at. We have got to find ways to hold down the cost of higher education. I hope that you will also take into account, David, are we gonna have a presentation on the 60 by 30 Texas plan? I hope you will take into account, I think all of you know about our new strategic plan in higher education, 60 by 30 Texas, or 60 by 30 Tex. This is a bold plan that's going to require bold strategies. Our goal is to make sure, our primary goal is by the year 2030, 60% of our youngest cohort of adults, the 25 to 34 group, will hold some form of post-secondary credential, and we're including certificates, associate's degrees, bachelor's degrees, and master's degree. That is compared to the current number, depending on the data that you use, of around 38%. So we're going to have to go from 38% to 60% in 15 years. That's quite a leap. We also want to produce 550 new completers by the year 2030. We want them to graduate with marketable skills that they can articulate, that they can describe when they go for job interviews. And then we want to hold down student debt. We want graduates of our universities not to have debt that does not exceed 60% of their first year wages, which is right just about where it is now, so we can't afford to go higher. And that's going to very much entail holding costs down. We have an ambitious plan, but that's exactly what it's going to take in order for Texas to remain and become still more economically competitive. As Steve Murdoch says, and he was part of our strategic planning group, as Steve Murdoch says over and over and over again, the challenge in Texas is very simple. The population that is growing the fastest, the population that will constitute the largest share of the state workforce by 2030 is a population that is least well educated. And of course, I'm referring to Latinos. If we don't do a much better job, and the evidence of closing the gap suggests that we can do a very good job with poor kids, particularly Hispanic children, but the evidence is that if we don't meet this challenge, we will decline significantly in economic competitiveness. We have to bring poor kids up to current standards of achievement and beyond. If we don't, the economy of Texas will sink. Family income will sink. Tax revenues will drop. And that's a situation in which we find ourselves, and higher education is always a key. But it's going to have to be a different kind of higher education than most of us, and I include myself, are comfortable with. So I look forward to the work of these committees. You've got some extraordinary challenges in front of you. I hope that, I should say I'm grateful that those of you that are serving on the committees have agreed to do so. It's hard work without much recognition or compensation, but it's something that we very, very badly need to do. Where do we go from here, David?
By law, we can't meet until 2 o'clock because that's a fixed hour. You can go to your breakout groups. 35 minutes for you to sort out.
Yeah, no, I was going to.
Well, a difference in that difference must be otherwise. Well, that's good news. Okay. So, do you have any questions? Otherwise, David will sort out the community college group. The university, the general academics are here. Who's Ed?
Questions or comments. I'd like to hear comments as much as I'd like to hear questions. You asked a very provocative question. I'll give you a provocative answer, and this is particularly in relation to universities. I think we're going to have to change the faculty reward system. Faculty reward system, the way we tenure and promote faculty. We don't give enough attention to service. And I think that a lot of what we need to do is service. I was at a conference last week where a professor of history and I guess he's a vice dean at the University of Southern California was talking about this great mentorship program that he had developed, where the students graduate at virtually 100% rate. I think he's had one student that didn't graduate in this program over the past, it's only been in place 4 or 5 years. But he pointed out that it was still a relatively small program. And I said, and I asked the question, why is that so? And he said, well, because faculty don't get any credit for doing this sort of thing. They have to do it on top of their research work, on top of their teaching assignments. And he pointed out that it's simply outside of faculty responsibilities. He pointed out that at an institution like the University of Southern California, research comes first, teaching comes second, and service is virtually of no significance at all. And he pointed out that mentorship program it's demonstrated that just meeting with first-generation college students once a semester, one professor taking the initiative, has had an enormous impact on completion rates. We have lots of other evidence. For example, I've heard stories of faculty that are working in local high schools trying to promote higher levels of success in STEM fields, particularly science and math, and they get good results, and then they're told you've got to go back and do your research. I proposed, when I was on the university campus, I proposed an idea that I thought was eminently sensible, and I think maybe 2 or 3 other people did as well, but it got killed in about 30 seconds. I pointed out that the faculty handbook of the University of California, and this is a quote, it's still seared in my memory, the one indispensable criterion for advancement in the University of California is superior intellectual attainment in teaching, research, and service. End of quote. And my idea was very simple. I said, now, if you can show superior intellectual attainment in service, for example, and you can show superior intellectual attainment in teaching, then why shouldn't that count as much as superior intellectual attainment in publication? Because my argument is that if you can demonstrate that somebody is working at the level of superior intellectual attainment, the reputation of the institution isn't going to decline. If you go from publishing 20 articles every 2 or 3 years to 10. And I said, if somebody can demonstrate superior intellectual attainment in these other 2 areas, then instead we know that departments, for example, have standards of publication. Say when you come up for tenure, you've got to have 25 publications in a given array of refereed journals. Well, if you can demonstrate superior intellectual attainment in teaching and service, then why not accept 15 or 18 or 20? And I made the argument, I probably shouldn't have said it out loud, but I said, I don't know of a single faculty member in the University of California, I said myself included, who couldn't diminish their bibliography by 20, 30% without any significant loss to the store of human knowledge in the world. Well, like I said, that idea got killed in about 30 seconds, but I thought that kind of policy does make sense. I think if an institution made a commitment, if a university made an institutional sustained commitment to helping poor kids succeed, I think that would enhance the institution's reputation as much as top-notch research. I think we're going to have to do things like that in order to meet our goals. We've got an awful lot of poor kids that are extremely bright, that are coming through the pipeline in Texas, but they need help. They need help. You know, we forget that most affluent kids who tend to do well in higher education do well because they have a lot of help. They get help from their parents. They get help from their older siblings. They get help from their neighbors. They live in environments where everybody goes to college. They have those support networks, and so many poor kids don't. And it's that simple in a lot of cases. They just need more attention. They need more help. They need professors telling them, I will help you. I'll do what you need in order to be successful. And we don't do it enough. But that to me is the most fundamental thing we have to address. And obviously that applies more to universities than it does to two-year institutions. Any other comments or questions? Okay, well, let's get going on to the next stage. Okay.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. I just want to let you know where the meetings are going to be this afternoon. Our Community and Technical Colleges Formula Advisory Committee will be in the Lone Star Room, which is on the second floor of this building at the back of the building. The Health-Related Institutions meeting is going to be held right next door in the Tejas Room. You can access that room from either of these two doors here on the side. And the General Academic Institutions are going to be held in this room up here at the round table in the front. So if you would all please join your group. And I think we've got Ed Buchanan here, who's going to lead those to the HRI meeting. And Roland Gilmore is going to be with the community colleges and the technical colleges upstairs. Thank you.
Dr. Robert Neely from Texas Women's University. Dr. Moore, are you on there yet? Okay. And I guess the other thing I should remind as individuals is that that those on the phone may vote as well, because they are considered in attendance for that. So anyway, as convening chair now, the second item on the agenda is a consideration of election of a chair and vice chair for this. So is there a nomination?
I nominate Dana Hoyt as chair.
I will second that motion.
Thank you. I guess any other questions, other nominations that we have? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposition? All right. Do I hear of a nomination for vice chair? I'd like to, I'm assuming I can nominate. I'd like to nominate Martin Baylor from UT Rio Grande Valley. Do I hear a second?
Second.
Any other nominations or discussions? All right. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposition?
Aye.
Who was the opposition?
No, it was the aye, I think, on the. This was a late aye over the phone. A late aye over the phone is what it sounded like to me. So, all right. Second agenda item then would be for our presentation here.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to be doing an overview of formula funding. For many of you, I think especially those of you who have been on the committee in prior years, this should be information you've heard before, but I think it's important that we do a broad overview before we begin our work. And here we go. This is what I needed. Thanks, Paul. Okay, this first slide, and I believe you all should have the presentation in front of you. I think some of our larger monitors weren't working today, and it is up on the screen. This first slide is a big picture overview of formula funding. The legislature decides the amount for the formulas. The coordinating board does data runs and provides the information to the LBB. They divide the total among the institutions, and each institution is allocated a slice of the formula funding. And I think that term allocation is very important in this context. I want to mention that the formulas are intended to be objectively and equitably allocated, or this system does objectively and equitably allocate the amount from the legislature. The institutions directly receive this funding in the General Appropriations Act. And also wanted to point out that the funds are not budgeted. They don't come through in line items. They're for the institutions to use as they see fit. Okay, and then we have several slides that walk through the timeline, and of course this committee is a very important part of the first steps in the timeline. Starting today with this advisory committee meeting, of course the committees will meet monthly for the next several months. You'll examine and consider changes to the formulas and present your recommendations to the Commissioner in February of 2016. And then in March, the CAP Committee, which is our Committee for Affordability, Accountability, and Planning, will consider the Formula Advisory Committee and the Commissioner's recommendation, and then will forward modified recommendations to the Board. And in April, the Board will adopt its final, the Coordinating Board will adopt its final recommendations for the formulas. Then in June, the Board's recommendation will be, or on June 1st officially, the Board's recommendation will be sent to the Legislative Budget Board and the Governor's Office of Budget Planning and Policy. The formula runs then will occur in the fall, and the initial funding run information calculations will be sent to the LBB on November 1st, and that run includes data from calendar year 2016. Appropriations bills will be considered in the 2017 legislative session using this initial data from the November 1st formula run. The final formula run will occur on March 1st. This is 2017, and it will include base year data, and I think it's important to understand the concept of base year, which will be summer and fall 2016 data and spring 2017 data. In May of 2017, the legislature will use the final data to allocate the formula funding to each institution in the GAA, in the General Appropriations Act. This is a pie chart that shows how the funding, overall funding for institutions, and the role the piece that the formula plays in this. It is not intended to cover all expenses. Its intended uses and ineligible expenses are listed in the chart on the right. So if you can't read it there, hopefully you can read it in your handouts. All funds formula revenues are represented by the two dark green slices on the outer ring of the pie chart. So these consist mainly of the formula general revenue and the appropriated tuition and fees, and this amount accounted for 16% of the institution's FY 2014 revenues. So that's historically what it was in the last session. Correct. Institutions reported sources and uses revenues of $13.3 billion in FY 2014. $4.3 billion were state appropriated, of which $1.6 billion were formula general and $0.6 billion were student paid statutory tuition and fees. And we'll talk about the statutory and tuition and fees in a little more detail later on in the presentation. So this gets into a little bit more detail about how the two formulas work, and then as we move on, we'll provide even more detail to you. But overall, we've got two formulas and we've got two supplements. We've got the Operation Support Formula, which supports the instructional operations, and it is based on census date enrollments. The enrollments are weighted by cost, and the institutions receive an additional 10% when an undergraduate course is taught by a tenure or tenure-track faculty member. Then we have the infrastructure formula support, which supports faculty operations and utilities, and it's based on predicted square feet, which is not actual square feet. It's what the square feet are predicted to be. And then, in addition to that, we have the smaller institution appropriation. Okay, so now we're going to actually get into the formulas. This is the Operation Support Formula, which is a more fairly straightforward as we move through, you'll see. We've got the funding rate in 2016-2017, that was $55.39 per weighted semester credit hours. Then we have a relative weight, which has to do with the program area and the level. And then we have the semester credit hours that are part of this formula. Okay, moving on. This is the teaching experience supplement, and this is what I mentioned earlier. This is the additional 10% bump for courses that are taught by tenure and tenure track faculty at the lower division level. And Okay, the next formula, it gets a little bit more complicated, and this involves the space support formula. So let me see if I can walk you through this. Instead of weighted semester credit hours, this formula is based on the predicted square feet, and this information is the result of the space model, which estimates the amount of space an institution needs, taking into account enrollments, faculty, research expenditures, and other metrics. And institutions' funding is the product of the funding rate, its predicted square feet, and the sum of two factors. So these two factors are designed to shift more funding to institutions that pay more in utilities. They are determined using the annual utilities survey completed by the institutions. And the operations and maintenance factor is the ratio of statewide reported E&G, educational and general expenditures, for operations and maintenance to the total. So the ratio of E&G for O&M to the total E&G. Correct? Okay. And in 2014, our institution's operational and maintenance expenditures made up 43.5% of the total E&G, and therefore the O&M factor for this last biennium was 43.5%. The utilities factor is the complement of that. So that came in the last biennium at 56.5%. So that 56.5% multiplied by the institution's utility rate adjustment. And the utility rate adjustment is the percent above or below the statewide average an institution pays for utilities. If an institution pays statewide average, then the sum of those two factors would be 1. And the institution's funding would be its predicted square feet times the funded rate. But if the utilities run higher than average, then the institution is going to receive proportionally more funding. Okay, I think that's the most complicated we're going to get. Now we're going to move into this small supplement formula, and this formula is basically designed because we understand that our small institutions are going to have certain fixed costs, even though they have fewer students. They're not going to have some of those economies of scale that larger institutions have. So the way this works is institutions with fall enrollment head counts of less than 10,000 will receive a portion of $1.5 million per biennium as their small institution supplement. And institutions with enrollment below 5,000 receive the full amount, and then it tapers off up to 10,000. Okay, this next slide is actually based on what the funding was for the past biennium in terms of the rate. So this is given the formula at the rate in the last biennium, but it basically shows for general academics how much of the increase seen from the prior biennium, from 14-15, was related to actual growth in terms of our semester credit hours, and how much was an increase, a rate increase overall. Okay, and then this is a formula breakdown. It talks about, in terms of what we saw in the last biennium for increases. So the operations support were up 8.2%. The teaching supplement was up 1.4%. Space support was up 5.4%. And the small institution supplement actually went down 8.9%. And I think a lot of that is attributable to growth that our institutions, our universities grew in the last biennium. Now we have several charts that actually show some trend data. This one shows the weighted semester credit hours and predicted square foot rates from 2000 until now, and you can see that the rate and the level per FTSE has been up 2 years in a row. And since the operation support rate is up 2%, just 2% from the 2000-2001 biennium, and the space support rate is down 24% from the 2000-2001 biennium. So that's looking at it over time. This next graph illustrates formula funding levels, and it also includes all of tuition funding. So it's not just that's part of the formula. The red and green stacked bars show the formula funding general revenue. And that's all the formulas and supplements minus the general revenue dedicated from 2000 until now. So we can see formula funding general revenue increased 38% from $2.5 billion in 2000-2001 to $3.4 billion in the last biennium, the current one. And then institutions increased tuition and fees from $2.3 billion in 2000 and 2001 to an estimated $8.1 billion in 16-17, and this is a 253% increase. So the blue bars, again, are all the tuition and fees. It's also important to note that the tuition reduces the formula amount, and the remainder is in general revenue, and that's the statutory tuition, which is part of the formula. It's in the general revenue dedicated funds. Okay, and this last graph that we have looks at the changes over time since the 2000-2001 biennium in terms of full-time student equivalents. And on FTSE basis, the formula funding general revenue from 2000 to now decreased 9%, from approximately $7,000 per student to approximately $6,400 for the current biennium. Non-appropriated tuition and fee collections increased by about 132% over this time, based on an FTSE basis. And we did take a look. Overall, full-time student equivalents have increased about 45% during this time. And that's actually true for semester credit hour increases. They're just around 45% as well, as is headcount enrollment. So we thought it was interesting to look at all three, and that's the growth that we've seen during that time. So that concludes our primer on formula funding. If there's any questions, we'll be happy to address them.
Yeah, I have a comment. In the materials that you sent, these two charts, you also have an equivalent chart that you adjust for inflation. And I think that in showing this chart, you tell a better story if you show the ones that are adjusted for inflation. And I would suggest that is done, because at least on the last one, on this one, the story that is portraying the chart changes when you adjust your numbers for inflation.
Okay, so this is the chart that we're seeing on page 16 of the materials that you were provided for the meeting. And yes, it does tell a little bit of a different story in terms of the formula funding rates. And we see the decreases there. Perhaps in our presentation next time we'll show both, because they do tell a little different story. Yes. Okay.
One question on the area where we're talking about the teaching experience supplement. I know this was a discussion 2 years ago. So that says tenure track faculty, and yet I believe in the formula it actually also includes full-time faculty equivalent. I mean, not equivalents, but full-time faculty.
No, they do have to be tenure or tenure track. There was a suggestion, and we did some runs last time where we also included full-time faculty, but those didn't move forward in recommendation, and they're not part of the formula at this time.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure what had passed and not passed on that. Okay. Any other questions on the presentation? Okay, on the next agenda item, I guess, is discussion of the commissioner's charges to us. And that was a lot of what Dr. Eklund just talked about. Was the first item there is to study and make recommendations for the funding levels for the next legislative session. And of course, this session we had was almost $4.7 billion. I think that part of what we're here today is to look at each one of these charges and then potentially discuss, which is what we did at the last 2 years ago, is look at different topics to discuss at some of the different meetings, so we can be prepared to discuss in detail some of those specific items. And so the suggestion I would have is for our next meeting in September to be prepared to discuss the formula funding levels and the models and stuff related to that in detail.
As we begin the discussions of the formulas, I know this would be opening up a big can of worms. But I think we have to look at what is the purpose of the formula. And it seems to me that there are two ways to look at the formula. One is formulas allow us to make equitable allocations of resources, equitable, objective allocations of resources. So where you have two like situations, those two parties get the same. Where you have two unlikes, they get something different. So we've set up a set of weights for student credit hours by discipline, by level, under the presumption that different disciplines, different levels have different costs associated with them. So we want to provide reimbursement, in a sense, to the institutions. There's another way to look at formulas, and that's to change behavior. So one is to get an equitable, objective allocation of resources. A second objective is to try to change behavior. And I think what we've done in the past is we've talked about that behavioral piece when we talk about the second charge, student success, and we say that 10% of the funding will be student success, so forth. The problem I see with that is if the bulk of the formula weight is our regular formula, where we have the weighted student credit hours based upon expenditures and so forth, and then we allocate whatever pot of funds the legislature puts out there. The incentive is for everybody to try to be UT and Texas A&M because they have more graduate programs, they have them in the sciences, and for you to get big bang for whatever expenditures you're making at the institutional level, you want to move in that direction. Now, does that get the behavior that the commissioner was talking about at the beginning? Does that provide any way to reward trying to get low-income, high-risk students to graduate? It may not. So I think, when we get into the discussion, I think we really have to look at what is the purpose for the formula and what are we trying to accomplish.
And I think that's a very appropriate suggestion, especially based on the commissioner's comments earlier that we may have to be thinking somewhat a little outside the box if we're going to accomplish what's in the 60 by 30 plan and not do everything as it's always been done. But part of that for them is that I know they have to spend a lot of time and effort to run different variations. So I think we have to articulate very clearly what we want to change as part of that purpose and how we want to do that, because we can that can take a lot of time and effort. So not that they usually do a very wonderful job running as many formulas as we need, but sometimes it's helpful if we can be very good about articulating what that purpose and charge is. So other discussions surrounding that we can have being prepared for that first part of that charge?
Well, I'll pick up on what you've brought up and say that most of our institutions are also engaged in a very serious effort to change the attainment rate. So it also, that ties into the behavior when it comes down to the specific university. And one of the things that was discussed towards the end of the last session was a possibility of us being able to bridge this sort of fair and equitable for everybody in the state with what is appropriate for the mission and of the specific institution that is trying to move forward on this student success piece. And there are some things, it's of course, the challenge is to find the common ground The second challenge, if you can find the common ground, is the politics of it. That if it impacts anybody significantly, the idea doesn't look as good. I mean, so I think there are we kind of walk this line kind of carefully as we move forward. But it is, the community college piece, which I have a vague understanding of, they did kind of work out some sort of process where they did work out, I think they call them momentum points. And I think they do that in regards to, in the framework of student success. And they reward, the way that it's described is that you're getting rewards when you get points that move your institution, your students, towards their attainment of a certificate or an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree. I think that there is some precedence on other, models that are right here in the state that maybe we need to kind of look at.
Oh, I see what you're saying. In the community college, it took me a moment there. I was like, what models in the states? So you're talking about the community college models that they've...
Right. It's not good. Obviously, it won't work one for one. Right. But it is, they did find a way to talk about some of the things. I know the impact on them just in terms of their interest in transferring to universities now for them to go on to the bachelor's degree, because they get momentum points when that is achieved.
Any other comments on the first charge and looking at that potentially being prepared for that for the next meeting? Again, if there is other items that we can help provide the staff in that discussion, that would be helpful. Second charge is actually with some materials on page 33 of your items there on the agenda. This was discussed at in the previous formula committee, and you see what the staff kind of laid out, what some of the recommendations were as far as the metrics and the ability to scale those metrics. They also provided information from other states. There's a very detailed table attached across those various states. The one thing that maybe we could add to that is it does mention the 2-year, and I think some people will be more familiar with the 2-year momentum structure than others, and so we might put that in there just so that it's clear what the 2-year momentum is. And because I think there's some connections, definite connections for transferability, associates to bachelor's degrees and items in there that would be useful.
Actually, I just pointed out the metrics that talk about retention to 30, 60, and 90 semester credit hours sort of reflects to some extent, and it's called momentum points in other states. Community colleges decided to call them success points in Texas. But I think that was a reflection of that, and so
I'll get you the 2-year version of that chart that we have currently in the agenda materials for the national perspective.
Yeah. I just think that we should be looking at least at what our own state has done on that, as well as those others. Yes. Lisa.
So just throwing out there, Harrison Keller from UT Austin. So one of the limitations of using momentum points the way most states use it, or the way the community colleges use it, is we still make assumptions about semester credit hours as being the unit of measure. And I'd argue that that's something that we shouldn't be so bound to, because what we found as we're working on lowering students' time to degree is it's important to draw a distinction between the accumulation of semester credit hours and the relevance of those credit hours towards a qualification. So, what we want to do is we want to encourage students in institutions to have efficient pathways. And so the ways that folks have conventionally been framing momentum points and thinking about semester credit hours actually pulls against efficient pathways.
In what way?
Well, if you want to maximize your formula funding, let's have students take more courses in residence. Let's add as, we want students taking more semester credit hours, not fewer semester credit hours. So what we ought to be doing is stepping back and saying, well, what do we want these graduates to look like? What are the most efficient ways that we can get them to that? I'd also throw out there that one of the disadvantages underlying the ways that Texas and a lot of states have thought about momentum points is they don't really reflect the reality or I would argue leverage the reality of how students go to college now. So we have nearly 2/3 of UT Austin students have community college hours that they brought with them. And a higher percentage of that have a prior enrollment at another institution of higher ed. That's really quite astounding, right? That's not the way UT Austin was even a decade ago. So what we see is students picking up semester credit hours lots of different ways, lots of different places. They do dual credit, they'll do AP, they'll do credit by exam, they'll do online courses. And all of that should be considered and encouraged as part of the efficient pathways, right? So it's not efficient for the state to encourage institutions to maximize semester credit hour generation. We ought to be thinking about, well, how do we encourage students to get to meaningful qualifications as efficiently as possible? And that can include the kinds of partnerships that now we're trying to pursue with other universities and with community colleges, and trying to leverage different modes of delivery for getting students to that qualification. So what we found, both as kind of an internal improvement measure, and I think has a lot of potential also as a metric for evaluation, is looking not at credit accumulation, but looking at students' progress towards degree. So because then what does the state care if it was a dual credit course or if it was a transfer course? The state cares as a student on track to having a qualification.
I think that's a really good point. The difficulty is, how does one do that for a formula system in a way that you can systematically do in a reasonable kind of way across institutions? And I think that's the one challenge there. And
You're prorated across.
Well, of course, one of the issues is it's across sectors. But what I'm thinking about is, you talk about progress towards degree.
Yeah.
I think that's more challenging when you try to systematize that for each institution, identifying it in the same kind of way. You and I have talked, at some level I think it would be great if we paid this much for a degree period.
Yeah, we're all for that.
That's a total departure.
Right.
But I think part of what we have to understand is, how can one reasonably do this? It's at the institutions in such a way that you're not all actually costing the institution more than the benefit. But I think we need to get exactly to where you're talking about.
So there's thinner and thicker specifications of things like progress towards degree. Like there's things that so there's some of the models that folks will use and that we've been working on refining, where you use some sophisticated predictive analytics and that kind of thing to try to figure out progress towards degree. I think those are more accurate at the student level, and they'll pick up things like, well, say they only lack 30 hours, but it's completely unrealistic that they could complete those particular 30 hours in a year, kind of thing. But then there's also a thinner specification that we use with students, like when students run their interactive degree audits, that basically just says, well, here are the requirements for your degree, and if you have half of them done, you're 50%. And so that indicator is one we're experimenting with as part of this. We're in this national alliance called the University Innovation Alliance, and we've been so with Ohio State and Arizona State and other institutions, and Georgia State's part of it, Purdue, and so we're looking at, well, Is that, even though we've got different degree requirements, we can still use that as an indicator where we make comparisons across institutions as we're trying to cross-pollinate, in our case, student success programs?
I think one thing all of you would need to discuss is whether one could take that process and have a formula in place in time for the next legislative session based upon that. That might be something that would take for the next session. I don't really know, but I think that's definitely worth discussing.
And I agree, there's some really good data analytics now that you can do, even predictive. If a student makes a certain grade in a course, then it predicts what their other courses and what they're going to need to be able to complete to finish a degree. And so I think that our analytics are getting to the point in time where we could potentially be looking at different types of approaches to funding. Practicality is I'm not sure we can get all of that to where it needs to be as quickly as we'd like, but I do agree that there's some things that are coming out that are predicting how, I mean, we're using that now to look at a grade and predict when we need to intervene for a student with advising on which courses and stuff. So all that's there, and it helps you to get to progress degree. But it's trying to figure out the funding approaches behind that is tough, and it's.
I'll say this one thing and then I'll shut up. So one of the things that I think's impeded committees like this is that they're trying to turn the whole battleship on a biennial basis, which is just unwieldy, and then it just devolves to everybody's looking at their runs and and that kind of thing. So one of the things that I'd throw out there for consideration, especially if there are things that the committee thinks might be interesting or at least worthy of consideration that leverages some of the innovative work going on, say with predictive analytics at Sam Houston and other institutions, is that maybe you don't have to turn the whole battleship, right? Maybe there can be ways that you make improvements in the system, but also give the commissioner more authority to have a subset of institutions where you could have a proof of concept. So you're not just coming in with another set of spreadsheets, but you'd have even the set of institutions that have the capabilities to be able to put this into practice. Then you've got an existence proof, right? Then you've got, we actually tested this out, or we tested out 2 or 3 different innovative models, and now that's going to do a better job of informing the decisions by the executive branch and the legislative branch.
I would agree, and I mean it's the same thing. We've got one of the charges is looking at competency-based education, and how do you analyze the cost structures and things related to that, which is very different than our normal credit hour production model. And what you're talking about is just another variation of that in a different way. And that's kind of what I guess that Commerce and Texas Southmost, I mean, they were kind of the pilots, so to speak, on some of that to see with some information on that. So, and I think charge 2 might be a good, and potentially looking at that after or next meeting or whatever, would be to have the discussions of are there some approaches and pilots that we should look at for those metrics, and broaden the thought and process of that on the metrics.
Go ahead.
No, I have a question after reading the material here. So I do like the idea of taking into account the success, the undergraduate student success, parameters. But is a proposal going to be to increase the funding or to add these parameters to the current formula? I don't know if I'm, because if you say, okay, now we're going to take 10% of what we're already allocating, and we're going to determine that 10% or X% based on this, then that creates other problems because you don't take into account the cost of producing those degrees. But if the idea is that we're going to increase the pie, or at least request to increase the pie, and that increase will be based on this, then that's a different discussion. So my question to the committee is, which one are we recommending? Is to include it in the current formula or to add for an increase?
Well, there's probably others that were on here when we discussed this, and that's where we were with the recommendation, was to fully fund the formula first and then to add an additional funding source for some types of performance-based metrics. It could be a large variety of items that could, we could have discussions of things outside these parameters, just as we were discussing, but that was the thought process that went in when we were looking at some of this modeling before.
And I'll stop. So it could happen that the legislature can say, well, we kind of like all these factors, so we're going to now allocate part of what we already allocate based on this. That's a possibility, or that's going to be part of our discussion.
Yes to both.
Yeah.
At one time, there were 13 formulas. Many years ago, and the legislature came in, and Senator Ratliff, and actually reduced them to essentially where we are now. Okay. And so there is that tension. Okay.
Yes.
Going back to my original point, and I know it complicates everything, but I would like for the committee to consider, instead of charge 1 and charge 2 as being separate, is to somehow combine charge 1 and charge 2 so that student success is incorporated in the base formula somehow. It may be that we have to recognize that what the research institutions are trying to do is different from what the comprehensive institutions are trying to do, is different from what the master's institutions are trying to do. I know that gets us more formulas, but it may be a better reflection of what we're trying to accomplish.
I think that's, when we come prepared to talk at the next meeting, I think that we have to look at how we want to, what do we want to define as a formula, other approaches to the formula, so we can get good definitions for the staff to try and run some data on. But, and I would argue then, all of it enters into the formula. I mean, I don't think any of these charges can be taken entirely separately, because competency-based education enters into that, on how you're going to look at that. And the 60 by 30, trying to accomplish the goals in 60 by 30 and encouraging that attainment is, I'm a college of business person, so from my standpoint, if you're going to reward something, that's what people are going to, from a business person's perspective, going to do. And so if we want to get 60 by 30 to be attained, we also need to look at that when we talk about the reward structure, and that would be the funding level. So while the charges are separately stated here, I don't think we can talk about charge 1 without having some discussion surrounding other items that might influence that. Does that make...
Yes,
as we're looking at the next meeting, I think that's a big key thing of trying to identify those factors that we want to look at.
So I'd like maybe to, because what we're really talking about here is we've had, when is the formula started? This goes back to the 60s, right?
I'm told it goes back to the 50s.
So the basic idea was access. It was all, the policy at that point was expanding access. It really, and the formula is really set up to promote access, participation.
I'm not sure about that. I think the formula is more about providing an objective means to allocate resources.
But the incentive piece was for everybody to get as many SCHs as they could get. And the way that you would do that is supposedly expand access to more and more people to higher education. I can remember doing plans for the Board of Regents in the 90s, and all we talked about is how we're going to expand, diversify the student body and expand it. That was clearly, and the formula really did seem to be rewarding that.
And that's true, but there's always an unintended incentive, which in some cases is for institutions encourage students to take as many courses as they want before getting a degree, which is what Harrison was trying to address. So that was an unintended consequence. Thus, most of our students have about 140 hours to finish a 120-hour degree.
And a lot of that because we're swirling around now.
Right. Well, I mean, I'd argue even on the graduate programs. I mean, we're penalized for right-sizing our graduate programs. We're because our these are heavily weighted semester credit hours, and so we would lose those weighted semester credit hours. Well, it may be a good thing from not just from an institutional perspective. It might be a good thing from the state's perspective to right-size graduate programs. I mean, in a former life, and this is not the position of my institution, I'd suggested that perhaps there should be explicit incentives for even closing graduate programs. Where institutions should be able to retain some funding or kind of wean themselves off of that weighted funding because it's not aligned with the kinds of goals that are in the new plan.
And along those lines, it was pointed out by committee a number of years ago that your point about an incentive for graduate programs, if you really look at the formula, you think to Julie's presentation, it's not as though you have as much money as you really need for that program anyway. So you still have to make up the money from somewhere else. So if one really understands the formula, understands real cost, in some cases you would choose not to have the program.
Doctoral programs, especially since you can't raise the tuition, since you have to pay the tuition. Yes. I mean, and since the formula is now much less of paying for that whole thing, that it was one thing when it was the support was more than 20%. So it is. I mean, it's especially in doctoral education, it's made that proposition very for the institutions. It's made it counter. The incentive is counterproductive. Yeah. I mean, a lot of what, if you look at what's happening, a lot of it, what's being paid, the doctoral programs are really paid by the lower division programs. So I mean, there are with the portion of the formula now covering. I mean, your charts make it pretty dramatic. I mean, the blue is the dominant. It is, and you see it as the future. I mean, the blue is going to be bluer. I mean, and longer, and so that is changing. In fact, what is the role of the formula in this upper in the graduate education? I mean, everybody from this is the way that this gets translated onto the politics of the campuses, because then the faculty says, well, obviously you would want a PhD program because you get such high formula funding for it. And I said, have you looked at a business model on that lately? I mean, there's no way that even if it is engineering and it's 16 or physics and it's 21 to 1, let me put it down for you, show you how much tuition we get that we cannot get from doctoral students because we pay for the doctoral students' tuition.
So I think that's the kind of the thoughtful way on this is to come up with some of those items so that we can come back and discuss specific ones at the September meeting so that then we can look at models for October. So what we've got is the formula funding discussion, charge 1 at the September meeting. October, we can look at models. We can also look more detail if we need and bring in information from other states as needed for some of those student success performance metrics. The third item is competency-based. The last committee charged Texas A&M Commerce to look at their costs on the development of their competency-based and how much that's costing them to do that competency-based program. And I think that they worked, and the coordinating board worked together, and that they'll be able to provide us the materials of that cost analysis in our packet that will come out for the next meeting for September. So you should be able to give that competency-based information some. So we can also look at kind of what that is as we're talking about the formula then. So you'll have the details behind that that for the September meeting. Charge 4 is to study and make recommendations on the treatment of pharmacy hours for professional practice. If you look, we've got some information here. I'm trying to remember. I didn't write down which page on that one. I did on charge
Page
3.
57.
57. On page 57. And so there are some materials, and I think that is kind of an individualized item a little bit more, so we'll probably look at that in the October meeting so that we can spend a heavy part of the September meeting on the formula and the variations on that, if that sounds... Right, and then if you move to charge 5, that we've got the new plan, the 60 by 30 plan, and that again is, I guess as a couple of you have mentioned, that shouldn't be entirely separate from the formula funding model, and so as we have the discussions. You might look at the 60 by 30 plan and be prepared if there's some items in that you want considered at that September meeting as well. There's a link, I believe, in the material, so you can, if you've not looked at it, you can pull that up and look at that plan.
Yeah, I think a good example from the plan is we were talking earlier about predictive analytics, and it is actually one of the strategies in the plan to use predictive analytics to think about completion.
All right, so other items on that are... Good. Then I guess the next item on the agenda is to look at the dates and make sure we're clear on the assignments before the next couple of meetings. Paul did a good job of surveying all of us to figure out when we can and cannot meet. And he gave, and also there were some dates there where this room isn't available that we couldn't move. And so it appears that there is a quorum on the dates that we had tentatively set. So it looks like we will have the next meeting on September 9th, October 7th, and then November 4th, or what is set at this point. Again, if there's some of you that travel is difficult, you can conference call in for those discussions. So, and then, so what we've, yes, ma'am.
Was there any consensus on the times for those
I believe
meetings?
we settled on that. We settled on that 1 o'clock, or where they were was on that 1 o'clock. So that allows travel time in the morning to be able to get here. So.
Okay, thank you.
So we've got 1 o'clock for those dates. So is there anything else? I mean, I mentioned the community college or the 2-year performance metrics that we would add to this packet. They're going to provide the competency-based cost analysis from Texas A&M Commerce with the next meeting. Are there other items that you can think of from information that would be helpful for the staff to provide for the discussion at the next meeting?
Would it help to have the summary document of the plan, goals, targets, and strategies rather than the full plan? Would that also be helpful?
That might be, summary page. So
yeah.
You're not, I have one right here where you can pull that up and look at it in your notebooks or whatever.
We'll be happy to provide that also.
Have it on my iPad, but that way I don't have to go back and forth.
Julie, I think Martha Snyder from HCM Strategist has put together some documents recently on what kind of states have currently done and are considering on different funding strategies. So it might be good to talk to her.
Wonderful, yes.
Yeah,
We'd be
she might
happy to
already
do
have
that.
stuff.
Okay, thank you.
I don't know if there's a way to do this. I came in late to the committee. I think I was there for the last 2 sessions. And hearing the commissioner's comments about the recommendation was to fully fund the formula, and then the legislature's seeing that as probably a very bold move. I don't know if there's a way to understand the balance between the recommendations of the formula and how the perception will be from the legislatures, or if there is already some expectations from the legislatures as to what is palatable in what we recommend. And that may be a very far-fetched statement, but it may help to guide some of the discussions as well.
Let me give you a couple of comments made by the Strategic Planning Committee that developed 60x30 text. And their thought was the last goal regarding student debt is a good beginning point, that to realize the connection between state appropriations, formula funding, the availability for student aid, money for capital budgets, and tuition, and that all these lead to directly, or at least very closely, to student debt and the volume of student debt. And they felt, Larry Faulkner particularly pointed out, that it's easier to talk about some resource issues in the context of what it means to the students. And so I don't know, I thought he made a good point.
Well, that's been proven that on that student debt is a factor of tuition as well as state support, all those. And so that's a good argument. I don't know. I mean, it's a good question. You know, if we ask for a level that's not even within the realm of where that is. So it's hard to pre-decide where the legislature might be on anything, I guess is the term I was trying to go for. So I think we have to do as hard a work as we can to look at and justify and provide the background and maybe we also want to fund some different approaches to see if we can change some of those behaviors or those things.
Could you summarize?
Just as like Dr. Keller was mentioning, I mean, there might be some items there that would help us with that.
Well, picking about David's comment, I mean, one of the big drivers of student debt is student behaviors, and so the cost of degree is gonna and the return on the degree are gonna depend a whole lot on the time to degree. You know, if they take a long, tortuous path that may or may not be because we've got Byzantine degree plans, then their lifetime earnings are going to be less. They're going to be more likely to have debt. So we need to. So again, I put a plug in as we're thinking about these funding models that we ought to think about the ways that students actually consume higher education, and are there ways to encourage institutions to sort of lean into those trends and take advantage of them, where right now we don't have any incentive to do that.
Well, and I mean, there's so many factors in student debt. I mean, it's socioeconomic, it's time to degree, it's the ability or many students now work while they're in school. So there's a lot of dynamics that enter into that.
And in terms of the time, we know that the longer a student takes to graduate, the more it costs them to graduate, because they inevitably take more hours, which costs them more, can lead to more debt. That tends to very often be students who have the least ability to maintain debt, and also costs the state more.
Right.
And so that's right. And I would encourage you to actually read the entire section on the debt in the plan, because some of these points are made.
Some interesting discussions. There's some good national data on that as well. So absolutely. All right, so
Something that, when I mentioned this about using the inflation chart, because to me it was a surprise, when I look at chart on page 20 of the materials that you sent, that tuition basically hasn't been going up, since the 08, 09, when you adjust for inflation. So I was one of those parents, I have 6 kids, and I'm one of those parents that believe that this debt is associated with the increase in tuition, but it's not. So it must be more the behavior, because adjusted for inflation, if you're looking here, statistically, tuition has not been going up. Now the appropriations have been going down. Okay, but if you look at the chart that is not adjusted for inflation, it looks like tuition has been going up.
But part of the context for that, too, is Texas was a very low-cost state to begin with. We were near the bottom of the 50 states. Now we're in the middle. So for parents who are used to even lower rates, and parents tend to compare what they're paying to what they paid, whether it's correct or not. And so all these things come together, and then when you link that, part of the participation issue also ties into the national media talking about debt actually well beyond what students have in Texas, about 4 or 5 times the debt students acquire here. And so part of it is even giving parents the correct picture. And typically the people who have the most debt aren't necessarily the poorest students, because the poorest we do a little better job of taking care of. I didn't say a perfect job, but a little better job.
So we have kind of the agenda set for the next meeting, which will be September 9th. We'll be looking at the information there, as well as the competency-based education information, be looking at what criteria or what other factors we want to model before the October meeting, and have those discussions with that. Is there an interest? I mean, you mentioned the student debt. I mean, there's other good data on that. I don't know if that's something that, but I think that may complicate the September meeting a little bit as we look at that. But
I could add, we could share for you, we have a website where we have all the videos from the various people who testified to the Strategic Planning Committee. And if you have any interest, you could select those on your own, which ones you might want to listen to. We had Sandy Baum, who's well known in terms of addressing student financial aid, and a few folks, so that everyone doesn't have to sit through that if you're not interested, but you're welcome to look at that.
all right, that'd be great. We'll send that out. So if any other items, all right, then I'll take a motion for adjournment.
Okay.
All right. And a second.
Second.
Yes. All right. Thank you.